Imagine giving your entire life to a company. Not 5 years, not 10, 40 years. Imagine your father did the same, and your grandfather before him. Then one morning, without warning, the gates are locked, your badge doesn't work, and a piece of paper tells you it's over. No goodbye, no explanation, just gone. This factory once employed 22,000 people. It built the machines that powered America, lit up cities, and fueled the modern world. And then, it vanished almost overnight. This isn't just the story of a company that failed. This is the story of how American industry rose, dominated, and quietly abandoned the people who built it. This is Westinghouse. And this is how everything fell apart. Imagine waking up one morning, getting ready for work the same way you've done for decades, pulling on your boots, grabbing your lunch pail, and heading toward the factory that built your entire life, only to find the gates locked with heavy chains and padlocks. No announcement, no warning, no meeting, just a single sheet of paper taped to the fence, telling you that your job is gone, not transferred, not paused, gone forever. That was the reality for thousands of American workers in December 1988, when the Westinghouse Electric Plant in East Pittsburgh shut down almost overnight. This wasn't a small factory quietly fading away. This was an industrial giant that once employed more than 22,000 workers at its peak. A place so critical to American infrastructure that it built the massive generators for Niagara Falls, designed electrical systems for New York City's subways, and manufactured nuclear reactors that powered submarines deep beneath the ocean. Entire families worked here for generations. Grandfathers, fathers, sons, sometimes even grandsons, all punching the same time clock, all walking through the same factory doors. For decades, Westinghouse made billions of dollars. The workers at East Pittsburgh quite literally built the electrical backbone of the United States with their own hands. And yet, by the mid-1990s, the factory was nothing more than a decaying shell. The machines were gone. The lights were off. Scrappers ripped copper wiring from the walls. Drug addicts shot up in abandoned break rooms. Homeless people slept in spaces where million-dollar turbines once spun. The buildings rotted. The town collapsed. 22,000 stable, well-paying jobs vanished. But here's the part that almost nobody talks about. The fall of Westinghouse wasn't inevitable. This wasn't some outdated company that never mattered. This was the same company that once defeated Thomas Edison. The same company that revolutionized how electricity works. The same company that helped electrify the modern world. So how did something this powerful collapse so completely? To understand that, we have to go all the way back to the beginning. Back to a teenage farm kid born in the mid-1800s, long before electricity powered cities, long before factories like East Pittsburgh even existed. Because the story of Westinghouse doesn't begin with collapse. It begins with one of the most important inventors and industrialists America ever produced. George Westinghouse was born on October 6, 1846 in Central Bridge, New York, a small rural town most Americans have never heard of. His father owned a modest workshop that produced farm equipment, and from a young age, George was surrounded by machines, tools, and mechanical problems that needed solving. This wasn't a household of abstract ideas or academic theory. It was practical, hands-on work. If something broke, you fixed it. If it didn't exist, you built it. When the Civil War broke out, George was just 15 years old. Like many young men of his generation, he was drawn into the conflict and joined the Union Army in 1863. A year later, he transferred to the Navy, where he served as an assistant engineer aboard warships. This experience would shape him for life. He didn't learn engineering from textbooks or classrooms. He learned it under pressure, keeping steam engines running while ships moved through hostile waters and people were actively trying to kill each other. After the war ended in 1865, Westinghouse briefly enrolled at Union College. He lasted 3 months, that was it. College couldn't hold his attention, but before dropping out, he filed his first patent for a rotary steam engine. This detail matters because it tells you something important about who Westinghouse was. He wasn't a dreamer in the way Nikola Tesla was, sketching revolutionary concepts in his mind. Westinghouse was a practical inventor, a businessman engineer, someone who took existing technology and made it reliable, scalable, and profitable in the real world. That combination was dangerous. In 1869, at just 23 years old, Westinghouse patented a compressed air braking system for trains. On the surface, that might sound unremarkable, but at the time, it was a life-or-death breakthrough. Before air brakes, stopping a train was an incredibly dangerous process. Brakemen had to run across the tops of moving rail cars, manually turning brake wheels on each car, often in the rain, snow, or darkness. Men slipped, fell between cars, were crushed by wheels, and died on the tracks. Even when everything went right, trains could take half a mile or more to stop, leading to frequent and catastrophic crashes. Westinghouse's solution was elegant in its simplicity. One system, one control, compressed air running through pipes along the entire train. The engineer pulls a single lever in the locomotive, air rushes through the system, and every brake on every car engages at the same time. In July 1869, he founded the Westinghouse Air Brake Company, but despite how revolutionary the idea was, almost nobody cared at first. Railroad companies were skeptical. They didn't trust it. They didn't want to invest in new technology, so Westinghouse did what defined his entire career. He tested it himself. He demonstrated it relentlessly. He spent years grinding away, convincing railroads one by one that his system actually worked. The real breakthrough came in 1872 when he invented the triple valve, an automatic mechanism that applied the brakes instantly if a train car became disconnected. No human reaction time required. No room for error. From that moment on, everything changed. By 1887, Westinghouse improved the system again with the quick-action valve, allowing for even faster emergency stops. By 1905, more than 2 million train cars and nearly 90,000 locomotives were using Westinghouse air brakes. He didn't just improve rail safety, he completely transformed the industry. And yet, this was only the beginning. Because while Westinghouse had conquered railroads, his attention was about to shift to something far bigger, something that would ignite one of the most brutal business wars in American history. By the early 1880s, George Westinghouse had already secured his place as one of America's most important industrial inventors. The air brake made him wealthy, powerful, and respected. But instead of settling into comfort, he turned his attention to a new and far more dangerous frontier: electricity. At the time, electricity wasn't the invisible, reliable force we take for granted today. It was experimental, unstable, and poorly understood. But it was also the key to powering the future. Thomas Edison had entered this space first. In 1882, Edison began building direct current, or DC power systems, to provide electric lighting in cities. These systems worked, but they came with a fatal flaw. Direct current could only be transmitted about 1 or 2 miles before losing too much voltage. That meant cities needed power stations every few blocks. It was inefficient, expensive, and impossible to scale beyond small urban areas. Westinghouse saw the problem immediately. In 1885, he purchased transformer patents from 2 European inventors, Gollard and Gibbs. These transformers made it possible to step voltage up or down, allowing electricity to be transmitted over long distances with minimal loss. The key was alternating current, or AC. Unlike DC, AC could travel far, then be safely transformed for use in homes and factories. On August 1, 1886, Westinghouse founded the Westinghouse Electric Company in Pittsburgh. It was a modest operation at first, employing about 200 workers, but Westinghouse wasn't thinking small. By 1889, he renamed it the Westinghouse Electric and Manufacturing Company, signaling his intent to challenge Edison directly. This wasn't just a technical disagreement. It was a full-scale business war that would determine how electricity would be delivered to the world. Edison understood that AC threatened his entire business model, so instead of competing purely on technology, he launched one of the most disturbing public relations campaigns in American history. Beginning in 1888, Edison supported public demonstrations in which animals were electrocuted using alternating current: dogs, cats, horses, even an elephant. The message was simple and terrifying. AC was dangerous. AC killed. Then, in 1890, the state of New York executed a man named William Kemmler using the first electric chair, powered by alternating current. Edison backed this decision, hoping it would permanently associate AC with death. The execution was horrific. Kemmler didn't die immediately. He suffered through multiple shocks over several agonizing minutes. Newspapers began using the term to be Westinghoused as slang for being electrocuted. Public opinion turned hostile. For Westinghouse, it was a public relations nightmare. But he didn't retreat. In 1888, Westinghouse hired Nikola Tesla, a brilliant but unconventional inventor whose ideas about AC motors were years ahead of their time. Tesla didn't last long inside a corporate structure. He left after only a few months. But Westinghouse purchased Tesla's AC motor patents outright for $60,000 plus royalties. That decision gave Westinghouse the technical foundation he needed to compete head-on. The turning point came in 1893 at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, the largest public event America had ever seen. The organizers needed someone to light up the entire fairgrounds. Edison bid $554,000. Westinghouse bid $399,000 and won. What most people don't realize is that Westinghouse actually lost money on the project. His real costs were closer to $600,000. But profit wasn't the point. This was about proof. Westinghouse illuminated over 250,000 light bulbs across the fairgrounds. 27 million people walked through the exhibition and saw alternating current working flawlessly. Cities, businesses, investors, they were convinced. Orders flooded in. The war of currents was effectively over. Edison's DC system was obsolete. Westinghouse had won. And now that victory needed a physical heart, a place where the future of electricity would be built at an unprecedented scale. That place would be East Pittsburgh. In 1890, fresh off his victory in the War of Currents, George Westinghouse made a decision that would define American industry for nearly a century. He purchased 40 acres of land in the Turtle Creek Valley, just outside Pittsburgh. The town was called East Pittsburgh. It wasn't wealthy, it wasn't famous, it wasn't beautiful, but it was perfect. Pittsburgh was the steel capital of the United States, which meant raw materials were everywhere. Turtle Creek ran directly through the property, allowing barges to deliver heavy equipment and supplies straight to the site. The Pennsylvania Railroad ran nearby, providing direct rail access for shipping finished products across the country. Land was cheap compared to downtown Pittsburgh, and perhaps most importantly, there was an endless supply of labor. Immigrants from Poland, Germany, Ireland, and Italy were pouring into the region, desperate for steady work. Construction began in February 1894. By November, the first buildings were completed: a machine shop, a warehouse, a powerhouse, and a brass foundry. On December 9, 1894, Westinghouse held a grand opening ceremony attended by Civil War veterans from the Grand Army of the Republic. This wasn't just a factory opening, it was a statement. A declaration that Westinghouse Electric was here to stay. The scale was unlike anything most Americans had ever seen. The complex sprawled across more than 2 million square feet of floor space. By 1904, 9,000 workers clocked in every day at East Pittsburgh, with another 3,000 employed at satellite plants. People began calling it the most modern factory in the world. The engineering department alone employed 350 mechanical and electrical specialists, an unprecedented concentration of technical talent. East Pittsburgh wasn't just a workplace, it was a self-contained industrial city. Machine shops, foundries, assembly lines, engineering laboratories, warehouses. Everything needed to design, test, and manufacture electrical equipment at scale existed inside the same massive complex. And while the factory grew, Westinghouse's ambitions grew with it. In 1895, Westinghouse secured the contract that would permanently cement his legacy, Niagara Falls. The plan was audacious: build a hydroelectric power plant at one of the most powerful waterfalls on Earth and transmit electricity 22 miles to Buffalo, New York. No one had ever done anything like this before. If it failed, Westinghouse's reputation would be destroyed. If it succeeded, it would prove that alternating current could power entire cities from a single remote source. Every critical component for the project was manufactured at East Pittsburgh: the generators, the transformers, the switchgear. When the plant went online, electricity surged through high-voltage transmission lines all the way to Buffalo. For the first time in history, a major city was powered by electricity generated miles away. The experiment worked perfectly. The war of currents was officially over. Alternating current had won. And in that same year, 1895, Westinghouse moved his primary manufacturing operations to East Pittsburgh. The original 40 acres began expanding almost immediately. More buildings went up. More workers poured in. The factory became the beating heart of the electrical revolution. By 1900, East Pittsburgh produced its first steam generator for the Hartford Electric Light Company. By 1904, the workforce had exploded. By 1915, Westinghouse founded Westinghouse Electric International, transforming the company from an American powerhouse into a global exporter of technology. Generators, transformers, electric motors, steam turbines, all flowing out of East Pittsburgh to power cities, factories, and infrastructure around the world. This was the beginning of the golden era, the period when Westinghouse seemed unstoppable, when the future looked permanent, when nobody could imagine what was coming next. After Niagara Falls, Westinghouse entered a period of dominance that reshaped not just the company, but the entire United States. From the late 1890s through the 1920s, East Pittsburgh was no longer just a factory. It was the center of gravity for the electrical age. In 1904 alone, more than 9,000 workers passed through its gates every day, and that number kept climbing. By 1920, the workforce had swollen to nearly 20,000 people at a single location. One factory in one small town employing the population of a mid-sized city. What were they building? The invisible systems that made modern life possible. Massive generators that powered electric grids. Transformers that stepped voltage up and down so electricity could travel hundreds of miles. Electric motors that drove factories. Steam turbines that turned coal and water into rotational energy. In 1904, Westinghouse built the electrical control systems for New York City's brand new subway. Millions of people rode those trains every year, and every acceleration, every brake, every movement depended on Westinghouse technology. By the 1920s, the factory expanded into radio equipment, transmitters, receivers, broadcasting gear, railroad signal systems that prevented nighttime collisions. If electricity moved, controlled, or powered something important, there was a strong chance it came from East Pittsburgh. Westinghouse, along with General Electric, formed a near duopoly on electrical equipment in the United States. Flip a light switch, ride a subway, work in an electrified factory, listen to the radio. Westinghouse was there. The money flowed in. The company was printing profits. But more importantly, the workers benefited. Jobs at Westinghouse were stable, well-paying, and unionized. Families bought houses, kids went to school, savings accounts grew. Retirement became a realistic promise, not a fantasy. Employment at Westinghouse wasn't just work, it was identity. Grandfathers worked there, Their sons followed. Their grandsons followed after them. Entire lives were built around that factory. George Westinghouse himself died in 1914, but the machine he built didn't stop. The company kept expanding because it no longer depended on one man. Engineers continued innovating. Managers continued scaling operations. Workers continued showing up every morning, building the future piece by piece. From 1895 to 1920, East Pittsburgh wasn't just part of American industry, it was its engine. Then came war. And with war came transformation. When the United States entered World War II in 1941, East Pittsburgh shifted into overdrive. Civilian production gave way to military manufacturing almost overnight. The factory began producing radar systems for ships and bombers, fire control systems for naval guns, turbines for submarines and destroyers, and communications equipment for troops on the battlefield. The plant ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, in 3 rotating shifts. The machines never stopped. As men were drafted into the military, Westinghouse hired women in massive numbers. Women who had never worked in factories before were suddenly operating lathes, welding steel, assembling complex electronic systems. By the end of the war, East Pittsburgh had produced more than 8,000 different military products and received multiple Army-Navy E awards for excellence in wartime production. After 1945, the company pivoted again. Soldiers came home. Families grew. Suburbs expanded. Westinghouse began manufacturing consumer goods at scale: refrigerators, dishwashers, washing machines, televisions. The slogan, "You can be sure if it's Westinghouse," became a national promise. The brand wasn't just trusted, it was part of American culture. And then came nuclear power. In the 1950s, the U.S. Navy needed a company capable of developing nuclear reactors for submarines. Westinghouse was chosen. In 1954, the company designed the reactor for the USS Nautilus, the world's first nuclear-powered submarine. The pressurized water reactor design that Westinghouse pioneered would go on to power roughly 60% of the world's nuclear plants. By the late 1950s, Westinghouse was no longer just an electrical equipment manufacturer. It was a defense contractor, a consumer appliance giant, and a nuclear technology pioneer. East Pittsburgh stood at the center of it all. 20,000 workers, cutting-edge technology, a town built on steel, sweat, and certainty. At least that's what it felt like, because beneath the surface, cracks were already forming. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, Westinghouse reached the absolute peak of its power. This was the mountaintop. The East Pittsburgh plant alone employed around 22,000 workers, the highest number in its entire history. The original 40-acre site had expanded into a sprawling industrial complex filled with dozens of massive buildings, each dedicated to a different stage of production. Westinghouse Electric was now a Fortune 500 company and one of the largest corporations in the United States. In the electrical equipment industry, there were only 2 real giants: General Electric and Westinghouse. Everyone else was fighting for scraps. The factory produced steam and gas turbines for power plants that generated electricity for entire cities, industrial control systems that automated refineries and manufacturing plants, generators for nuclear power stations being built across the country, electrical systems for subway networks in New York, Boston, Chicago, Washington, D.C., and the newly built BART system in San Francisco, elevators and escalators that moved millions of people through skyscrapers every day, military radar systems that tracked enemy aircraft and guided missiles. If it ran on electricity and mattered, there was a very good chance Westinghouse built it. East Pittsburgh wasn't just a factory. It was the economic engine of the entire town. Nearly everyone who lived there either worked at Westinghouse directly or depended on it indirectly. Grocery stores, gas stations, bars, diners, clothing shops, all of them existed because tens of thousands of workers had paychecks to spend. The union was strong. Wages were good. Benefits were solid. Health insurance, pensions, paid vacations. You could buy a house, raise a family, send your kids to college, and retire with dignity on a Westinghouse paycheck. For generations, this was the deal. You showed up, you worked hard, the company took care of you, and for decades, it worked. But even at the peak, warning signs were already there. Most people didn't want to see them. Starting in the late 1960s and accelerating into the early 1970s, Japanese manufacturers began entering the global electrical equipment market in a serious way. Companies like Mitsubishi, Hitachi, and Toshiba weren't small challengers. They were massive, well-funded, and technologically aggressive. And most importantly, they were cheaper. In some cases, they were selling turbines, generators, and transformers for 30 to 40% less than Westinghouse. At first, the impact was subtle. A contract here, another one there. Orders that used to be automatic suddenly went overseas. Inside Westinghouse, management knew this was a problem, but the solutions were ugly. Modernizing the East Pittsburgh plant would cost hundreds of millions of dollars. Cutting wages would trigger strikes. Raising prices would drive even more customers to foreign competitors. So, management hesitated. They delayed. They hoped the problem would go away. Meanwhile, Japanese factories were modern, efficient, and purpose-built with the latest production technology. East Pittsburgh, for all its size and history, was running on equipment that in some cases was 50 or 60 years old. The buildings had been designed for a different era. The production lines were slower, the cost structure was heavier, and slowly, quietly, Westinghouse began losing its edge. The workers on the factory floor didn't see this. They showed up every day. They built turbines. They assembled generators. They trusted the system that had worked for their parents and grandparents. The town still looked healthy. The factory was still running. The union was still strong. From the outside, everything seemed fine, but underneath the foundation was weakening. And when it finally gave way, it wouldn't crack slowly. It would collapse. In October 1973, the world changed overnight. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, imposed an oil embargo against the United States in retaliation for American support of Israel during the Yom Kippur War. Almost instantly, oil prices exploded, rising nearly 400%. Gas stations ran dry. Lines stretched for blocks. People waited hours just to fill their tanks. The American economy, which had been built on decades of cheap energy, slammed into a wall. For Westinghouse, the timing couldn't have been worse. The company depended on massive infrastructure projects, power plants, turbines, generators, long-term utility contracts. When energy prices spiked and the economy slipped into recession, those projects were the first to be canceled or delayed. Utilities stopped building. Governments froze spending. Orders for Westinghouse equipment collapsed. In 1974, the layoffs began. Not dozens, not hundreds, thousands. Men who had spent 20 or 30 years at East Pittsburgh were suddenly told they were no longer needed. The shock rippled through the town, but management framed it as temporary, a slowdown, a pause. Things would bounce back once the economy recovered. They didn't. At the same time, foreign competition was no longer a future threat. It was a present reality. Japanese and South Korean manufacturers were now undercutting Westinghouse on price in almost every major bid. A turbine that Westinghouse sold for $1 million could be delivered by Mitsubishi for $600,000, and the quality was just as good, sometimes better. The question was obvious. How could they do it? Lower labor costs were part of the answer. American factory workers earned $15 to $18 an hour. Their Japanese counterparts earned $6 to $8. But that wasn't the whole story. Their factories were newer. Their production methods were more efficient. They had invested heavily in automation and modern equipment, while East Pittsburgh was still relying on machinery installed decades earlier. Westinghouse started losing contracts it had once considered guaranteed. A power utility in California chose Hitachi. A project in Texas went to Toshiba. Customers who had bought American for generations now bought overseas because the numbers simply made more sense. Inside the company, panic replaced denial. Instead of doubling down on what they did best, management chose a different path: diversification, broadcasting, real estate, financial services, cable television. The logic was simple. If electrical equipment was becoming too competitive, the company would make money somewhere else, spread the risk, hedge the future. But Westinghouse executives were engineers and industrial managers, not media moguls or financiers. They bought companies they didn't understand, paid too much for them, and mismanaged them badly. While leadership was distracted chasing new industries, the core electrical equipment business continued to bleed market share. And then came March 28, 1979. At the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, a pressurized water reactor suffered a partial meltdown. The reactor design was Westinghouse's, a valve stuck open. Cooling water drained from the reactor core. Operators didn't recognize what was happening in time. Part of the core melted. Pregnant women and young children within a 5-mile radius were evacuated. No one died directly from radiation, but the fear was overwhelming. Public perception didn't care about technical explanations. Westinghouse's name became associated with nuclear disaster. Protests erupted. Planned nuclear projects were canceled across the country. Orders for nuclear equipment evaporated almost overnight. A cornerstone of Westinghouse's future vanished. Back in East Pittsburgh, the effects were immediate and brutal. More layoffs, more buildings shut down, benefits cut, pensions weakened, overtime disappeared, morale collapsed. Workers who had trusted the company for decades realized something terrifying. Westinghouse wasn't coming back, and the worst was still ahead. By the early 1980s, East Pittsburgh was no longer declining quietly. It was being dismantled in real time. In 1982 and 1983, Westinghouse made the decision that sealed the factory's fate. The steam turbine generator division, the heart of the entire operation, was relocated out of East Pittsburgh. Not expanded, not duplicated, moved. The jobs went south to Florida. The expertise went with them. The production lines were dismantled piece by piece. What remained was a hollowed-out shell. By 1987, management stopped pretending. The announcement came that the East Pittsburgh plant would be shut down permanently. Some sources later claimed the closure happened in the mid-1990s, but that's not true. The real end came between 1987 and 1988. The layoffs didn't come all at once. That would have been too honest. Instead, they came in waves. 100 workers here, 200 there. Each round described as restructuring, temporary, necessary. The final blow landed in December 1988. Workers who had spent 20, 30, even 40 years at Westinghouse were called into conference rooms and handed termination letters. No warning, no explanation. Just a severance check and a handshake. One worker described it simply. His grandfather worked there for 45 years. His father worked there for 35. He worked there for 18. All three lost their jobs. 3 generations erased in a single decade. Westinghouse didn't just shut down a factory, it carved itself apart and sold the pieces to the highest bidder. The transportation division went to AEG in Germany. The elevator and escalator business was sold to Schindler in Switzerland. The transmission and distribution business went to ABB. Years earlier, the appliance division had already been sold off. The Westinghouse name remained on products, but the company no longer made them. For East Pittsburgh, the impact was catastrophic. Restaurants closed, bars emptied, stores boarded up their windows, housing prices collapsed. A home worth $80,000 in 1980 was worth $20,000 a decade later, if anyone would buy it at all. Young people left as fast as they could. Anyone with ambition, education, or options got out. Those who stayed were the ones who couldn't leave. Retirees, workers too old to start over, families trapped by underwater mortgages. The town's tax base evaporated, schools merged or shut down. Public services deteriorated, roads crumbled, parks went unmaintained. The factory itself became a ruin. Buildings sat empty. Scrappers broke in and tore out copper wiring. Homeless people slept in old break rooms. Drug addicts used abandoned offices to shoot up. Fires broke out, some accidental, some not. Nobody bothered stopping it. This wasn't just an economic collapse, it was the death of a community. Westinghouse, the corporation, had already moved on. Executives collected bonuses. Shareholders got dividends. The people who built the company with their hands were left behind to pick up the wreckage. But even after all of that, the story wasn't completely over. After the shutdown, the East Pittsburgh plant didn't just sit empty, it decayed. Decades of heavy industrial manufacturing had left the land deeply contaminated, and once the company was gone, there was no urgency to fix it. The soil was saturated with PCBs, toxic chemicals that had been used in electrical equipment for generations before their dangers were fully understood. Heavy metals like lead, mercury, and arsenic had seeped into the ground over nearly a century of production. Turtle Creek, the river that once made the location so valuable, was polluted with industrial runoff. Fish couldn't survive in it. The water was unsafe. Children couldn't play near it. Portions of the site were eventually designated as contaminated by environmental authorities, meaning nothing new could be built without massive cleanup efforts. And cleanup required money, millions of dollars. Time measured in decades. Meanwhile, the people suffered in ways statistics never fully capture. Many former Westinghouse workers never recovered financially. Some found new jobs, but they paid half of what Westinghouse had paid and offered no pensions, no long-term security. Others went back to school in their 40s and 50s, trying to learn new trades in an economy that no longer wanted industrial labor. Some burned through their savings. Some lost their homes. Banks foreclosed on houses that families had lived in for generations. The psychological damage was just as severe. Westinghouse hadn't just provided jobs. It had provided meaning, identity, pride. When that disappeared, many people lost their sense of purpose. Depression rose, alcoholism increased, drug abuse spread, divorce rates climbed, suicide rates followed. The union that had once been one of the strongest labor organizations in Pennsylvania shrank from thousands of members to barely a few hundred. The union hall that once overflowed during meetings sat nearly empty. And then there was the corporate erasure. Between the late 1980s and the late 1990s, Westinghouse dismantled itself completely. In 1995, the company bought CBS, a television network, a move that symbolized just how far it had drifted from its origins. In 1997, Westinghouse officially renamed itself CBS Corporation and moved its headquarters to New York. The name that had once defined American engineering vanished from the industrial world. In 1998, the last remaining piece of the original business, power generation, was sold to Siemens. Westinghouse no longer built turbines. It no longer built generators. It no longer built anything. The brand itself was passed around, sold, and resold, licensed to whoever wanted to slap the logo on appliances made overseas. The name survived. The company did not. Back in East Pittsburgh, the people watched all of this with a sense of betrayal. The corporation that had built their town had erased itself, leaving behind unemployment, contamination, and silence. The factory that once powered half of America stood as a rusting monument to abandonment. But surprisingly, not everything stayed dead forever. For years, the East Pittsburgh plant looked like it would remain a permanent scar on the landscape, a ruin, a reminder of what was lost. But in the early 2000s, something unexpected happened. An organization called the Regional Industrial Development Corporation, RIDC, acquired much of the former Westinghouse property. Their goal wasn't to recreate what had existed before. That was impossible. Instead, they aimed to adapt the remains to a different economic reality. The site was renamed Keystone Commons. Rather than a single industrial titan employing tens of thousands of people, Keystone Commons became a multi-tenant industrial park. Dozens of smaller companies moved into the surviving buildings: fabrication, logistics, warehousing, light manufacturing, research and development. The massive overhead cranes that once lifted turbines weighing hundreds of tons were still there. The high-ceiling manufacturing bays still stood. The lights came back on. By the early 2020s, more than 40 companies operated at Keystone Commons, employing roughly 1,100 people. That number is almost meaningless compared to the 22,000 who once worked there. This wasn't a comeback. It was survival. A shadow of what had been. In 2013, 34 retired Westinghouse workers returned to the site for a guided tour. Men who had spent their entire careers inside those buildings walked through the same spaces decades later. Some pointed to where they used to work. Some stood silently. Some cried. One of them said it best: "The products and methods have changed, but the space is still being used." It wasn't the ending they wanted, but it was something. East Pittsburgh today isn't a ghost town, but it isn't what it was. The population is smaller. The downtown is quiet. The sense of shared identity is gone. People commute elsewhere. Some work at Keystone Commons. Some stay because it's home and nowhere else feels right. The factory no longer defines the town, and it never will again. So what does this story actually teach us? First, no company is too big to fail. Westinghouse was one of the most powerful corporations in American history. It won the War of Currents. It powered Niagara Falls. It built nuclear reactors. It employed generations. And yet, it collapsed in little more than a decade once the world changed, and it failed to adapt. Second, diversification is not a strategy if you don't understand what you're diversifying into. Westinghouse abandoned its core strengths instead of fixing them. It chased industries it didn't understand while neglecting the one thing it had always done better than anyone else. The result was failure on all fronts. Third, workers and communities always pay the price. Executives leave. Shareholders move on. But towns like East Pittsburgh are stuck with the consequences: lost jobs, broken identities, environmental damage that lasts generations. And finally, legacy is complicated. Westinghouse, the company, is gone. The brand is hollow, but the ideas remain. Alternating current powers the world. Pressurized water reactors still dominate nuclear energy. The innovations that came out of East Pittsburgh are embedded in modern life, whether people know it or not. Companies die. Progress doesn't. But the people who build that progress are often forgotten. The Westinghouse East Pittsburgh plant operated for 94 years. From 1894 to 1988, it grew from 200 workers into 22,000. It powered a nation, it collapsed, it left a town behind to deal with the aftermath. And in that story, you can see the entire arc of American industry: rise, dominance, complacency, collapse, and a smaller, quieter rebirth. Not triumph, not recovery, just survival.